Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. This is the Big Data Hangover. So we are talking about today understanding the messy state of data management, what you need to know, what you need to be aware of, and really how to overcome that hangover, which I know we've all been there. So let's get into it. We have a really fun crew today. So obviously myself, hi, I'm Michelle Nieberding, the Director of Product Marketing at MetaRouter, joined with the awesome Juan and Miles, and I'll let them do a quick introduction.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Juan Mendoza. I'm the CEO of the Martech Weekly. We're a global media and research firm in over 65 countries. And we help executives, leaders in the marketing technology domain really make sense of what is a very complicated, very complex, and fast-moving industry. So I'm so excited to be here. This whole concept of the data hangover is definitely, I think, what a lot of people are feeling right now in the industry. So I'm going to throw over to Miles.
Thanks, Juan. Hey, Miles Younger, Head of Innovation and Insights at UF Digital. UF Digital is the leading training and education partner for the digital advertising, marketing, and media industry. We train teams on big topics that are affecting their business, many of which do involve data. And so in our world, the antidote to data hangovers is better data education. But yeah, Michelle, thanks a lot for having me.
I love it. Thank you guys for being here. I just loved this topic of a big data hangover because, like we said, we're all kind of feeling it right now. For me, it's like, like that feeling when you wake up after a night of, well, I like to say your data pipelines were flowing a little too freely. So your head might be pounding, you're, not feeling so good. There's a lot coming in, but you're not quite sure how to overcome this hangover. And it really impacts not just you, but everyone and, everything that is touching that data. Juan, I know you like a good party, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what this data hangover is like.
Yeah, so I remember when I was a teenager, and we'd have these huge house parties. I'm sure Miles and Michelle, you've experienced something similar, right? There's somebody making out in the hallway. There's beer is free flowing. People passed out on the couch, and it's a crazy time, right? And if I could use that analogy for the past 15 years of advertising and marketing technology, I would reckon it with that, which is it's been a massive fat party, a lot of free flowing money, a lot of technologies, and a lot of data, so much data. But it's been a very good time. I would say that, it's made literally millions of careers of people working in this space. And it's also built some of the most valuable, largest companies the world has ever seen, such as Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Meta. And so the past 15 years has been historically a very good time in the tech industry. But I want to talk a bit more about data and how much data has grown on the open web. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of a zettabyte. Now, a zettabyte is I think it's 1 billion terabytes. So 1 terabyte is a huge amount of data storage. 1 zettabyte is 1 billion of those terabytes. And as you can see, the amount of data that's now available on the web, it continues to exponentially grow. We're now at 120 zettabytes, which is 120 times 1 billion terabytes. It's a astronomical, can't even fathom, mind-blowing number. But if we look at the frat party and the crazy time, the free-flowing money, the unbelievable amount of growth in this space, what I've seen is that the amount of data has grown. The amount of data companies are collecting is grown as well. But just to talk a little bit more about how data has grown, we've got this concept at the Martech Weekly called Carpe Diem, made famous from the very, very good film, The Dead Poets Society, where, Robin Williams, the actor, he gets all the students together and he talks about the previous generation of students and their message for them, which was Carpe Diem, which basically means seize the day. And we've taken that concept to sort of mean something new, which is carpe datum, which is a Latin word for data. So carpe datum, seize the data. And if we look at the past 15, 20 years, it's definitely been a season of that, seizing the day. But now what we're seeing is seizing the data, platforms collecting more data, really trying to drive a first-party data audience as the ad tech ecosystem changes. I'm sure, Miles, you have plenty of thoughts about that. But if you track just the amount of software apps and the online advertising spending, it is astronomical. It has become something that is almost unwieldy. We've got more than almost 14,000 marketing and advertising technologies in the ecosystem. And along with that, we have more than 250 billion in spending year on year in the online advertising space. So a lot of money, a lot of data. But what does that lead to? I might get you the next slide. Thank you. That leads to the hangover, which is a lot of headlines in the past 4 years, really triggered by Cambridge Analytica in the last decade in 2017, 2018, was that real trigger point for the society at large, but also the industry to think more carefully about where is all of this data going? What's all this spending going? If we think about it, some of these headlines here are pretty damning. Sephora, they're a consumer brand. They were fined more than $1 million for violating the Californian regulation a couple years ago. And they're a consumer brand. They're not a massive tech platform. They're not an ad tech player, but they were found to share their data accidentally with third parties and advertisers where that did not align with their consent policies with their customers. So they were fined. We have some of the larger giants, for example, Apple, TikTok, and Google. They're all facing all different kinds of data regulations right now of different shapes and sizes. The current DOJ case against Google is a really good example of this data party coming to a close. Oracle's surveillance machine targeting U.S. Targeted U.S. privacy class action. It's not just regulators, but individuals and corporations banding together to really sort of put the full force of the law against some of the larger companies that collect and commercialize a lot of data. And so when you look at the sort of this space, we've had this massive frat party. It's been a huge amount of money and free-flowing beer and crazy parties and wild times. I'm sure, Miles, working in the ad tech space, you've seen plenty of that. But now that party is kind of coming to a close. The police are knocking on the door. People are jumping over the fence. They're leaving the party because of this problem around data. And Michelle, I might throw it back to you just to give us some numbers around the problem of bad data management that we're seeing in the industry.
100%. I mean, the numbers really are mind blowing. I think, as a marketer, you hear collect more data, that's always been a big push, but you don't think about the impact necessarily. Or, if you do, you often think in terms of revenue, right? I mean, that's where my head goes: bad data, garbage in, garbage out, in so many senses of the word. But when you look beyond just revenue specifically, right? So there's the revenue impact, but there is the cost that comes with that. The dissatisfied customers, of course, because your data isn't right, or you're not routing the right data or accurate data to the right places. And of course, we've talked about, as we just saw, the regulation component there. But something I hadn't thought about prior, so I thought this was really interesting, is really the cost of poor decisions. Now, there's a lot that can go into that. But when you think about $3 billion of money that this crazy, chaos that's been happening with all of this data and the poor management of it has been causing, I mean, that to me, that's really something. Talk about like the hangover you really don't want. That's it. I don't know. What do you think, Miles?
So I did put some thought into, what is it that's really causing, what is it that makes the hangover analogy apt in this context? This concept of a data hangover. And I was thinking, and this gets back to some of the charts you were talking about, Juan, is, it's like everybody's being overserved at a bar. It's like we're at a data bar and the bartender never says no. Bartender will always say, oh, you want another shot? You want another pitcher? You want another drink? Of course. So we've all been overserved at the bar because in the world of data, ad tech, martech, it's easy to find somebody who will always just give you more data. It may not be very good data, but there's a lot of sources of data that you could potentially tap into and pay for. So, that's one thing. The other thing is, when you're hungover, and you party too hard, you probably weren't keeping track of what you were drinking. And I think the same thing holds true in the world of data, is you stop keeping track of all of this data that you're consuming, that you're saying yes to. And then what happens, which is basically what we're looking at in this photo, is you end up in this haze where nobody can remember what happened the night before. And Michelle, this gets back to the slide that you just had on, is what does that lead to? It leads to poor decision making. These four guys, they don't know what happened the night before. Look at them. They're completely perplexed as to why they're in that elevator, what's going on, what's going to come next. And so I think the same thing, ends up holding true in data, is that, we overindulge and lose track of where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed.
100%. I think what rings really true to me here is like you're saying, all the sources at so many places that you could be collecting data. To me, it's like, at the end of the night that you consider getting that one more drink, you think, what, it hopefully won't push me over the edge. Like just one more, right? That phrase, just one more data source, just one more, whatever. And that can be what pushes you over the edge. And so 100%, I feel the pain, the struggle is real. So let's get into the nitty gritty of what this really means and why is data management itself such a mess? Why are we having these problems besides just all the data coming in, right? So we'll go through a couple stats here and really dig into the meat of what this means. I don't think it's a surprise. We talked about revenue, but I don't know if we all can really think about how much revenue is impacted by poor data. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? This is just one of the many things that messy data that's caused by this influx of volume has caused. So my first question to you, Juan, is really, what is this current state of data management? What does that really look like? And why is it such an issue? Why are we having so many problems with it?
Yeah, there's a variety of ways to answer that question. But I do want to point out that stat first, that experience stat, because that's 27% of revenue is lost due to poor or dirty data. That's over 3 trillion annually. So that's a lot of revenue, $3 trillion. So if we want to start somewhere, maybe we start with the dollars, because data is basically dollars. The more you can use your data, the more you commercialize it, the more better opportunities your brand has. And then that should equal to better revenue, better margin, better profitability. So starting there, I think, is a good point, because I think what we've seen is a massive disconnect between the commercial strategy of companies and the data management and the data analytics and the orchestration of that data. And because historically, in the enterprise at least, those teams are being very separated. You'd have your marketing, your advertising folks on one side, then you have IT on the other. And we're still in this messy, dirty, sort of scrounging around space, because those teams want to work together. But over the past 10 years, it's been oil and water. It's been actually really hard for those teams to get together to align themselves. But what it means is that when data is not collected properly, say, for example, a marketer doesn't really understand the data they're collecting through a tag management solution and just kind of collecting everything, it means that there's a lack of integrity, there's a lack of rigor into that data collection strategy, which an engineer or a technology team would be far better placed to do. But on the flip side, the tech teams will set things up, build things, incorporate technology, buy technologies to manage data without really understanding the ROI. So often projects kind of just go all over the place or nowhere, because they can't track it back to a demonstrable value back to the business. And so I think the symptom here, and I think this is that current state, is that these two teams, the data management, engineering, and IT side, and the marketing, advertising, commercialization side, are just still struggling to work together to really show that. And, we'll talk a little bit later about what that looks like when it's in harmony. But I think that's a good place to start, is that these teams still really struggle to figure out the value of data. One example, just to talk about, a customer I worked with years and years and years ago, was that, they reckoned that their data management practices was like a Jenga block. They're just adding pieces as they go, and there was nothing unified. There was nothing orchestrated. It was all just, we've got this new commercial opportunity, or we've got this new product. Let's go build that thing. And then, oh, we need a new system for that. Okay, there's another pocket of data. And then here's another thing. And the blocks keep adding up, but then it just falls over like a house of cards because there's no unifying strategy. So I think that is why we're seeing that 3 trillion annually lost and that 27% of revenue lost due to poor or dirty data. I think a lot of it comes back to alignment between teams and that commercialization and then the data integrity strategy coming together. But Miles, what do you think? What do you see in this space?
So I think one of the key kind of failures that come about when you've got too many data sources that are too easy to tap into, and they're not brought into the organization in a particularly orchestrated way from, a bird's eye view, is, for instance, you lose the ability to partition data that is driving different outcomes. So let's just say that your company or headline statistic of X number of percent of revenue is lost to bad data. I bet most organizations don't have their data partitioned in a way that they could begin to measure how performant various data sets are. Put this another way. Let's say that you really wanted to be data driven about your data, and you had two large teams or lines of business, and you said, this line of business is going to use data sources A, B, and C to drive their decision making. This line of business is going to use data sources D, E, and F to drive their decision making, and we are going to perform an A/B test and see who does better, who makes better decisions, and that will then allow us later to see which set of data sources is better or worse. And so that's completely hypothetical, but that's what I mean by this idea of this very, very basic inability to partition data in a way that actually allows a company to connect the dots back to ROI. Because I bet most companies would be hard pressed to run that kind of an A/B test. They just say, oh, what data sets are different teams using to drive their decision making? Well, A, we don't know. B, they get to decide. C, it probably changes a lot. So, ask me today and then ask me a week from now, it's probably changed. And so I think that's another thing that is really at the core of a lot of these challenges to connect data strategy and data collection back to ROI.
I mean,
Yeah.
lost in translation is a real thing. Being on the marketing side, it's crazy to me because I never thought I'd have to be so data conscious or even, learn so much about privacy or the almost, translation that happens between IT and marketing. And we're really moving in that direction, I would say.
And we're starting to see that. I mean, even the embrace of the cloud and Miles, you've been doing some fabulous work in this space, just tracking how the cloud is getting into ad tech and martech. But one small comment I have on that is we're seeing this sort of maturity curve, and we're seeing this this embrace of the data warehouse, because it really forces the issue of where your data lives. Like if you're going to buy another SaaS app, it's going to collect another bespoke, unique set of data. It's going to sit in another database owned by another company that you're buying a subscription from. You just keep doing that. It just becomes totally unwieldy, right? And I can totally, I would say that with a lot of marketers out there, I resonate with how they feel often, where it just becomes too chaotic and too big, too hard basket. It's like, oh, we can't really shift things because all our data is in this platform and that platform, and it kind of works, and we can still get stuff out the door, but we all know that it's not the right way, just adding more and more data systems into your business. So the embrace of the cloud, I think, is one of these really interesting categories where brands are starting to think about how do they bring that data back into a central repository, cut away all the unwieldy apps that are doing all kinds of different things, and try and bring some harmony back into the business when it comes to data orchestration.
To this point that there's this migration to the cloud, Juan, you said something about, data living in data silos that are, connected to these SaaS platforms. The other thing to consider is a lot of those platforms don't actually come with databases. You get some platform reporting that's native to the platform, and maybe there's ways to export a few, do some flat file data dumps out of these platforms, get a CSV export or something. but a lot of them don't even come with databases. So that's driven a lot of like cloud adoption. It's like, well, as a, as an organization, a marketing organization, for instance, gets more digitally mature, they start to ask more sophisticated questions of their data, and they run into brick walls with the platform because they say, oh, there's nothing to query. Like, I've already outgrown the standard built-in reporting. I need something to query. And a natural answer to that set of questions is often a cloud data warehouse, because it's the cheapest to get started, it's the cheapest to maintain. You're not taking on a ton of overhead and risk. So anyway, that was just something I heard you say that I wanted to dig into a little bit more.
And it's interesting because I have a question for you, Miles. Did you learn how to write SQL in your career at some point?
Yeah, that was as an ad tech founder. I learned to write. I'm not any kind of a SQL maestro, but yes, that was when I learned.
Well, here's the thing. The question I ask often is, should marketers be learning SQL? In my career, I learned SQL because I needed to interrogate data warehouses and databases and even like ancient marketing automation platforms.
Yeah.
Need to learn SQL. But when I learned it, the world of data opened up for me. Just because I could understand, okay, I can actually pull whatever data I need. I can join tables. I can, create these schemas that would suit the business. And it gave me all these opportunities and really was a light bulb moment. And maybe that's part of it here, is that the integration with the warehouse and even tag management platforms requires a certain level of data literacy and education, and even a mind that really wants to understand that. Not a lot of marketers want to understand how SQL works. But when I learned it, I remember, wow, it was just so much fun, right? But
if you know SQL and you're working with a system that won't let you use it, it's extremely frustrating. If you don't know SQL and you're presented with a SQL interface, query interface, you're pretty frustrated because you don't know what to do. But I think what a lot of organizations probably aren't addressing is a systematic way to categorize employees, both in terms of their current abilities and where they want to go, either as an individual or as a team. I would bet 99 out of 100 organizations have no idea how many people inside my walls know SQL, how many people want to know SQL, how many people don't want to know SQL, and kind of develop strategies based on that. Because until you do that, you'll never really optimize your data stack and the way that people want to interact with that data stack, because you're just kind of flying blind. But no, SQL's awesome if you know it. Yeah.
Well, I like that. So as on the marketing side, most specifically, right? I love this analogy. One, I'm like, now I got to put on my list to go learn SQL, because I think, that's genius. It makes sense, but you're creating that common language that I can then go talk to the IT team and say that I know what the heck is going on and why I need data, and kind of have some awareness of how to get there. And I think, that is kind of that bridge. It's like literally learning a new language so that you can have those deeper conversations and, in a way that everyone understands it. So I think that's huge. And even back to the cloud point, right? Like, to bring it back to our analogy of this big data hangover, I see the cloud providers as kind of like the bartenders, right? They're going to keep encouraging more and more drinks, right? But if you have tabs with a bunch of bartenders at a bunch of different bars, like, how are you going to, settle up at the end of the night, right? How do you make sure everything is paid and centralized, and you got one tab, to make sure you're good at every place. So it's funny to think about within this analogy, because it's just so true.
Well, we could do an entirely separate webinar on the cloud services hangover of like getting too overexcited about cloud services. Juan, I'm sorry, you were about to say something.
No, I think it's right. Like, the excitement around data cloud and the embrace of it is fascinating, purely because of the mentality. I think the mentality behind a lot of this stuff is that people in the brands see this as an insurance policy, first and foremost, which is, we better collect it now because we never know the use case that will come down later. We never know. And if we collect it now, we set the tag, we set an event, we stream it in the warehouse, or we start getting our offline files in. You just never know when you're going to when you need to do a personalization use case on a very obscure and specific data point that represents 10% of your database. But, well, we may use it one day, so let's keep it as assurance policy. That's kind of the premise of Amazon Redshift, isn't it? Which is, put it in cold storage, and then we'll freeze it for you, and then you can thaw it out when you need it, which doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to use it. And actually, like the thing that people don't realize, I think often especially with the cloud, is that data collection in the cloud is an opportunity and also a liability for your business. It's a legal liability. If you get audited for your data management practices, which more companies are now, as I mentioned about Sephora, they got audited by the regulator and they were found to have, improper data practices. Now, if you've got all of this data and it becomes harder to manage, and there's stuff that, like, let's be honest here, people change jobs, people leave and all their knowledge leaves with them. And you've got all this data you've never even seen before, just sitting in there. What you're going to have is a liability on your hands. You're going to have a data privacy liability. You also have to be a custodian of that data. There's also a factor here around data deletion as well. Consumers want to, and even at the Martech Weekly, we've had a few subscribers come up to us and say, we want all of our records cleaned from all your databases. And I'm like, oh, crap. It's going to take some time. And if you have all that stuff sitting in Redshift or into these cold storage platforms, what happens is that those requests become untenable.
Yeah.
And so that's the challenge here, is seeing data like data collection as insurance policy is probably more of a liability than an insurance policy, in the sense of you may have to actually spend a lot more to maintain it and also comply with regulators as regulations change as well. So,
100%.
yeah.
Like we hear that more and more, and it's I think we're finally seeing the tables turning about having to be proactive about that stuff, because I feel like previously it was on the back burner, at least for sure for marketing. But now we, like all of the headlines you showed, I mean, it's having to take a forefront, which I think is important, but still a bit of a struggle. So I feel that. And I know, Miles, we've talked a little bit about, data privacy, data influx. Let's talk about something else real quick, just a little bit in terms of accuracy. So we've talked about, the trickiness that comes with data silos and the translation that needs to happen amongst teams. With this crazy state of data management, how have you seen in the ad tech space that really impact kind of the accuracy that comes with, analytics or retargeting or anything like that?
Yeah, so ad tech, digital media, digital advertising in general, there are a lot of ambiguities around accuracy. It's a pretty broad spectrum. All the way on kind of one extreme end, you have just plenty of outright fraud, and on another end, you've got kind of just data that's essentially open to interpretation. So I'll give you an example. There's one of the current kind of hot button issues inside the world of digital media is so-called made for advertising sites. So this would be like a site that you would go to where, I don't know, you're flipping through a carousel of like celebrities, like, I don't know, celebrities who've had facelifts, and there's like 50 photos, and you're just like killing time at work flipping through this photo carousel of 50 celebrities who've had facelifts. And every time you flip through the carousel, another 10 ads load on the screen all around what you're looking at. These sites are, like, from a media traditionalist's perspective, just absolute garbage. But they do hold consumer attention pretty well. Like, a lot of people scroll through all 50 to see which celebrities had facelifts. Like, they're fairly effective. But these are called made for advertising sites. And so, they tend to be sites that exist only for the purposes of jamming the page with ads. It's not really about the content. There's certainly no like journalistic or other kind of, positive qualities like that would be associated with this content. And so if you think about like data accuracy, if you are, let's say you are collecting digital media performance data as an advertiser or as an agency. And as you're rolling up reporting, so you start at the very base level of like impression level activity. And if you're a large advertiser, you could be running, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, possibly even billions of impressions per unit of time, quarter, year, whatever. You start rolling up from that and you start bucketing things together. At some point, somebody's making decisions where, for instance, the New York Times and the celebrity facelift carousel have been conflated in an apples to apples basis. It says, oh, well, you ran 1,000 impressions on the New York Times and you ran 1,000 impressions on the facelift carousel. And in the report, it looks like you just ran 2,000 impressions. It makes no distinction that, well, half of that was on garbage. Half of it was on a high quality site, half of it was on garbage. And so you end up making decisions based upon kind of a skewed version of reality where an ad impression is just an ad impression is just an ad impression. It's like, no, just because they all add up to a certain number in your report doesn't mean there weren't qualitative differences to that original impression, or the clicks that they drove, or the audiences that they were reaching, or the prices you were paying to be on those sites. Because an average marketer would have an expectation of paying a far lower price to be on the celebrity facelift site than they would pay to be on the New York Times. And just one of the things that happens with data accuracy in the digital media world is a lot of those things end up getting kind of bundled together, and it obscures the fact that there is a wide range of qualitative difference in that data, but then somebody's making decisions with no respect paid to that qualitative difference. And then we wonder why, for instance, there's so much waste in digital media. The quote ad tech tax is so high, et cetera, et cetera. And that it's partly because the data isn't inaccurate because it's lying necessarily. It's inaccurate because it's forcing apples to apples relationships where there are none. An impression on New York Times is an apple, and an impression on the celebrity facelift carousel is an orange. Those are not, they're both technically impressions, but they couldn't be more different. So that's just like one kind of tactical example, and that just permeates the digital ad landscape. And Juan, you're more familiar with kind of the MarTech landscape of how those types of inaccuracies and obfuscations and apples and oranges comparisons kind of permeate the world of MarTech data, just like it does the world of ad tech and digital ads data.
Yeah. It's one of the challenges with this stuff is this whole concept of being analytics brained, right? It's all about numbers in, numbers out, right? Which is kind of what you're portraying there, Miles, is that it doesn't matter if it's on the celebrity carousel or New York Times. It's data in, it's data out, it's conversion rate. And yeah, as long as we fill up the funnel and we convert a certain number, we'll be fine as a business. And yes, that is obviously technically true because it's just data in, data out. But on the other side, it's about your brand. It's the qualitative aspects of that data as well. Yes, you're filling up the conversion funnel, but if it's on an MFA website or if it's on some far right extremist, crazy, whatever, conspiracy theory website, that's going to impact your brand in ways that you will never see, but will impact your long-term performance as a business. So where the data is going matters so much, not just to the performance of a business, but its brand and its where it wants to be positioned as well. And that's why I think Miles is right for you to call out that there is a huge problem with MFA. But on the MarTech side, what I see a lot of is the mixed incentives of how that data is portrayed or used. So for example, a lot of CMOs and directors of marketing and senior leaders in the B2C enterprise side, they kind of grew up before the internet. They had their career defining opportunities perhaps as the internet was starting along. And so often they don't have that data literacy to ask the questions to a agency or a consultancy or someone that's in the marketing or performance marketing team, showing them numbers with very little context or very little sort of rationalization around where they come from or what they mean to the business. Now, I'm kind of talking here about integrity and honesty when it comes to reporting. And the way I think about any kind of marketing reporting or analytics is that it should reflect reality. Like your data is a window into the reality of your business, where it's going, where it's been, and what the current state of play is. And often that reality is maligned just because of incentives, right? You want to look good in front of the CMO. People get scared to report bad numbers in front of an executive team. The agency wants to keep their customer because often massaging the numbers is just one way to get there, and it's all too pervasive. So I think that what you're opening up here, Miles, is really interesting because it's talking about the gradients within data, right? The quality, the high and low quality of data in which you're collecting. And I think that's something that's often missed in what I call like the analytics brained side of the marketing world.
Yeah. So, and I think you're absolutely right to call out incentives because, for instance, if you are paying, for instance, you say to your agency, well, I've got a chunk of media budget to deploy. I want to reach this many consumers over this many probably impressions and this kind of frequency of exposure and at this particular rate or CPM. If the agency or any technologies that they use to deploy that media budget ends up saying, well, I don't know, it's more efficient for us to just deploy it to these MFA sites, and you get back their point. It's like, here, you asked for impressions. That's what we gave you. You
Yeah.
didn't tell us the any nuance to that. And that goes all up and down the funnel where if you do get too essentially analytics brained, as you put it, Juan, and you fixate on, I want to optimize to this thing, and this thing, you will find vendors and partners that will optimize to those things. But it ends up being this kind of like, it's like when you rub the lamp and the genie comes out and you're like, I want all the money in the world. And if they just dump it on you and crush you or something like that, it's like, well, be careful what you ask for, like, because they will find a way to kind of give you technically what you asked for, but without, completely ignoring these kind of qualitative differences.
Yeah, where the money flows is where the data goes, right?
Yeah.
And exactly the point is setting the right incentives with your team, your partners, even your technology vendors is so critical to getting that as close to reality as possible. I'm a believer that there's no data that will show you a perfect view of reality, right? There's always bias, there's always gradients and gradations in that data that have different views, and also your interpretation as a person. And your background, your skills, your experience will have an influence on your perception of reality. But I think the goal with analytics is to, like, it's a very scientific endeavor. It's to get as close as bloody possible to reality, and the reality of the business. And, so that takes integrity, it takes skills. Also, most importantly, as you say, Miles, it takes the incentive. It takes the money. Where the money goes is where the data flows. So it's very helpful.
If I was to, just the last point I'll make here to connect this back to our remarks on cloud data warehousing is, certainly one way, if you as a marketer want to verify where your ads are running and you want to get, really detailed log level data on your ads, your partners, tech or services partners may be willing to provide that to you. That's a separate question. But if they do, you're probably going to need a cloud data warehouse because it's a lot of data. So that's just, another one of these things where a lot of roads end up leading to cloud data warehouses for instance, marketers who really do want to discover some deeper truth in their data. You can do that, but you're going to need some environment to actually do that analysis because the platforms probably aren't going to give it to you natively.
So true. And I think I won't go down this rabbit hole today, but I would say two other things that we're hearing just to complicate things even more is one, bots, which again, we could talk about that all day, but also variability. So we'll see different teams what they think is looking at the same set of metrics, but they're vastly different. And the variability can be insane. And so how do you make decisions, whether that be in MarTech or ad tech, when we're seeing 20% plus variability in metrics in different tools. So I won't go down that rabbit hole today, but when we're talking about messy data, like messy data management, it just, keeps going. So, all right, wrapping up here with a couple final thoughts looking at this stat. So we've talked a little bit about these things, but any final thoughts around data management in terms of performance, compliance, privacy risks, etc.? The reason I'm asking this specifically is there's so many people looking at things like taking back control of their data, right? As part of this data management chaos that for so long has been kind of up to third parties and browsers to kind of help own that ecosystem. What are your thoughts? And Juan, we can start with you on kind of what some of these additional consequences are looking like, or really how can we think about starting to potentially solve the data hangover? What is that liquid IV for what we're dealing with right now?
It's a really big question, but as we sort of close up, I think there's a couple things here. The first thing is data privacy regulation is happening, and the trend is not less, it's more.
Yeah.
So what that will mean is across, so for example, United States, in all 50 states, there's different types of privacy regulation developing. It's in review. It's all happening at the same time. We got the CCPA, but the GDPR, which is the European data privacy regulation, is the gold standard. You know, most places, for example, I live in Australia. Most brands here look to the GDPR as the way they're going to future-proof their marketing tech stack, their data management practices, even though the regulation in Australia is nowhere near the GDPR. And so I would say that the challenge here is that in an increasingly regulated space, what we're going to see is more scrutiny around who uses data in a business. You know, like right now, if you're in a company, you're a marketer, you could probably do whatever you want. You could set another tag, you can run an event, you could maybe run some SQL. You know, I've been in situations in the past where I've been able to pull up a full, you know, PII database from a SQL query, names, email addresses, what they've purchased, and it's just sitting there in an Excel file on my laptop. So the days of that is probably coming to an end, I think, because we're going to start to seeing data licensing and the sort of professional code of conducts come in for data management professionals. And I think that's one main thing to think about here when it comes to regulation and data privacy controls, is that we're going to have to see a lot of brands really rework their stack, rework their performance, and even, I would say, in some countries have a regulatory body that would oversee the use of management of data. Why is this happening? I think the main thing why, you know, and I think what the real reason here is that increasingly governments are seeing data privacy violations as a human rights violation. You know, it is in the UN Charter of Human Rights that no person should infringe on another person's privacy. And the narrative around this, particularly driven by media, is that the major ad tech platforms, the consumer brands, they're all looking to invade your privacy for profit. And because of this culture shift, you know, it reminds me a lot of, actually, going back to the hangover analogy, is smoking or drinking, you know, or doing drugs, right? Like there was a time ago when smoking was basically, everyone did it. Doctors recommended smoking, but then over time the culture shifted and people started seeing smoking as a negative thing. And that was driven mostly by regulation. And what we're seeing here with data collection, I think we're seeing the same thing, where data collection will be something that's so sensitive that you would have to have a specially licensed person to manage it. So I think that what's happening on the horizon, that's where I think it's going, is that regulation will force corporations to think very seriously about the systems they use, but more importantly, the skills and the eyeballs on that data.
I could not have said that better myself. I mean, we're very much seeing that on our end as well, especially in that tag management space, because a lot of what you're talking about, being compliant, being secure, being private, respecting privacy, starts at data collection, which obviously is where MetaRouter plays. So hugely agree with everything that you just mentioned. Miles, would love to hear your thoughts as well.
I think one way to view the whole question of data privacy as it relates from like the sort of entire food chain, from collection to, you know, storage and operations, and then potentially you have to retrieve it and delete it, you know, if you get a request like that, or prove its provenance later, if you have to prove that you got consent for something or whatever. I think another way to look at it is that privacy priorities or needs or requirements are really just one facet of overall operations that you need to perform on your data. So if you as an organization are collecting data, and whether you go through an audit or something happens and you realize, oh, we can't identify where we got this piece of data, or this person says that we collected their data and we can't find them, or we can't find every instance of them. What does that say about sort of more benign use cases like simple personalization? Like privacy is abstractly is just one kind of priority for data. There's other priorities like, generating ROI or personalizing things for consumers or making consumers happy. And so if you look at privacy as just one in a whole family of operations you need to be able to effectively perform on your data, if privacy is giving you a lot of trouble, and it's giving a lot of organizations like a lot of trouble, large and small. Um, that really should tell you a lot about the efficacy of the way that you're collecting and storing data overall. So for more positive purposes, in addition to these more kind of high stakes high stakes kind of liability laden areas like privacy. That's just it's just one way to think about it. As all these organizations are kind of having a real wake up call of like, wow. So we started looking into our data because of privacy, but because of that, we realized, wow, we don't know where this stuff came from. It's not tagged
Yeah.
properly in terms of how sensitive it is. And if it was sensitive, did we get consent? All of this explosion of kind of questions that need to be answered about this data cannot be answered. And so what does that tell you about the next time you're going to personalize an offer for somebody who's in your app? How effective do you think your personalization really is?
Man, we have come a long way since first name personalization in an email, like it's
Right.
come such a long way since, I remember getting excited about that. And here we are talking about personalizing journeys and, doing deeper. And I think, like you said, what we're seeing now is privacy's kind of taken a back seat for so long that now it's only becoming an issue when something's identified and you're in triage, like you're not being proactive about it, making sure this doesn't happen ahead of time. And like you said, that's like one of many things you should be looking at. Where is it coming from? Is it accurate? Is it tied to the right person? Is it, all of these pieces of the puzzle that you have to think about, which again is probably why data management's so hard, right? If it were easy, everyone would do it,
I mean, I think, data management, one of the things that is underappreciated about it still. So Michelle, you mentioned, say you imagine a past where personalization was just a first name. So you had one point of personalization.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point in the future, you added another point of personalization. Who knows what it was? Maybe his phone number or something. In the intuitive way to look at it is that your complexity may be doubled. It's like, okay, now we have two. I think it's more like it increases like with the cube. Like your complexity actually increased like 8-fold. Maybe you didn't realize it at the time, but organizations have now added many different data points to all different aspects of their marketing and advertising operations. And that complexity has just exploded. I mean, I think it's, it's like your zettabytes thing, Juan. I mean, you're talking about permutations upon permutations upon permutations. And it's something that I think the practice of digital marketing, digital advertising, analytics, and so forth is still kind of coming to grips with just how much the complexity of everything explodes as you're just adding these data points that you're collecting.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who's never personally finished a Rubik's Cube, I'm now thinking about that in terms of customer data. It's kind of blowing my mind in a good way. But the complexity, the way that things have to work together to make it, accurate, is kind of a wild way to think about it. So I like it. Let's jump to one more quick thing that I think is very important to this whole conversation, kind of the core we talked about a little bit earlier, in terms of having this kind of data literacy and common knowledge to have those conversations that make sense, right? As a marketer, I have, really tried to dive in deep into this data literacy world so I can have those conversations. So I can go to my team and say, I want to tag for this reason, and here's what that means, right? So Miles, I know this is kind of like your specialty. So I would love to hear kind of maybe some tips or tricks for the audience on what data literacy means and how we can be thinking about it moving forward.
Yeah, thanks. So we've kind of, discussed data a bit in the abstract and sort of from a more technological standpoint, but, being at U of Digital, being on the education side of the business, if we're thinking about data, we're really thinking about things like data literacy, and certain, there's a lot of manifestations of it. And I think it is equally a driver of so-called data hangovers to more technical reasons. Is data literacy really drives a lot of the challenges that kind of plague the industry and persist year over year. There is this tendency in data and just digital marketing and advertising overall to kind of immediately fixate on technical concepts that essentially leave non-technical stakeholders out of the conversation in certain respects. But then it gets complicated because the non-technical stakeholders are usually the business decision makers who are creating the sources of data. So you've got people downstream on the data pipeline working on the data saying, oh man, this is horrible data. There was there any plan here when this was collected? You
Mm.
know, we can't deal with this. And then, you know, lo and behold, the decision makers at the beginning of the data pipeline are kind of lacking in some basic data literacy concepts. And so there's just like all kinds of things that permeate the industry. I mean, one, like you're in a consultative business. You're in the business of kind of like helping people to understand the MarTech landscape, which like
Mm.
part of it is understanding the data. So I'd be curious, like at the MarTech Weekly, like what kind of interest you're seeing in concepts that unpack data or ways that you've tried to unpack it, you know, in your newsletter or for
Mm.
clients.
Yeah. I'll have, as we're wrapping up, I'll mention one funny one I use often with our audience, which is, you know, like the metaphors for data is like data is oil.
Mm-hmm.
Another person said that data is sand, right? Which is like data is this natural resource, but you got to refine it until it's commercialized, right? It's actually could be really powerful and valuable. Same with sand, right? Like it's sand, it's that, you know, it's thousands of billions of grains of sand on the beach, but until you actually turn it into something like glassware, it's not valuable, right? But the third one that we use often is data as nuclear sludge, right? So bear with me a minute here, because our audience has found this helpful, because if you think about nuclear waste, it's very powerful, right? It's an incredible power source. It comes out of the reactor, and it's waste, and you can't use it ever again, right? It's just radioactive, toxic. You have to store it thousands of kilometers, you know, away from people and underground and locked away. But the real thing, which I find fascinating about this analogy, is that data as nuclear sludge means that, well, we don't actually know how nuclear waste will transform over the next 1,000 years, right? Like, because it persists, it's radioactive for thousands and thousands of years. We don't know what the next generation is going to do with it. We don't know what 100 generations from now is going to do with it. We have no idea, right? And it's one of those natural resources that we really have no solid plan to manage, purely because it persists for many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. So, and when you think about data, think about it like that. The data you collect today, or you put it, as we were talking earlier, like into like an Amazon Redshift cold storage, that data may come back to bite you. You know, like think about the long-term effects of how data is collected and managed, because if you don't, it can become very unwieldy, and it may cause more damage than not. And that's one thing I think about a lot, is that, you know, what are the ideas that people have for data management? And data
Yeah.
as nuclear sludge could be a helpful one, but it's one of those ways of thinking about, you know, it's not just the, you know, what is an integer and what's a SHI 256, what is X and Y, like all the tactical, practical stuff is for specialists. But for executives, they need to think about their data from a perspective of long-term health and opportunity. And if they
Mm-hmm.
don't think about it like that, then you just end up with tactical ideas that go nowhere. So that's how I approach it. But yeah, it's very interesting thinking the ideas that we kind of share around data and data management.
So a slightly like more benign perspective than radioactive waste. But I think that's very interesting in terms of the ways that data literacy or a lack thereof can have really this kind of magnified downstream impacts. Because, for instance, if you have decision makers who don't fully understand sort of the data consequences of their decisions. They say, oh, well, they talk to their tagging team or whatever. Can we collect this data point in addition to the whatever 90 other ones we already collect? And the tagging team is like, well, we can. Like, there's nothing really stopping us. But if your decision maker doesn't really understand everything, that when they say, all right, collect that data point, all right, now you got to pull people off of other stuff that they were working on. Now you got to create another field in this data table. Now you have to add to your data dictionary to explain what's in that field, and all your table relationships get messed up, and somebody has to, rework all of that. And then, oh, the reporting in Tableau is now messed up, and somebody's got to go fix that thing. And if the decision maker who made the decision doesn't understand any of that, it's not that they're insensitive to it. They literally don't understand that any of that is
Yeah.
going on. To them, it all just happens kind of magically. And there is this notion that, like, be very careful about the decisions that you make, because you may think you're making one decision, but you're actually making like 50 choices for 50 different people and teams who are going to have to, very slightly, adjust course based on this decision that you made. And a lot of that does come from just not having an understanding of, for instance, how data flows through your organization. So anyway, like I said, a little bit more benign perspective on the radioactive waste, but I take your meaning.
I mean, I love that analogy, because I have the Hangover, the movie playing in my head of, like, one bad decision leads to X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Someone losing teeth, a tiger waking up in your hotel room, like all of the chain effect that those decisions have that you might not be thinking about or expecting.
Right.
I mean, absolutely.
Yeah, and we're temporal creatures as well. Like, it's very hard for us to think about anything that is beyond the next 15 minutes. We're thinking about lunch, like what's happening for dinner. Very hard. It's like conceptually, like humans are very hard for us to conceptualize something in 1,000 years or something in 100 years, and that's a problem with data, is that, as you say, Michelle, and it's very well put, is that one small tweak in strategy, one event that's collected could mean the difference between being sued for $500 million in 5 years from now, Yeah. And it's literally those small exponential changes, because data is exponential, it continues to accumulate and it continues to compound as we use it. So yes, trying to cultivate a long-term mindset is actually something that works against us, because we're so temporal, it's very hard to conceptualize, but it's well worth doing those activities, I think, to think through it, because it gives you a perspective that you may not otherwise have when it comes to making those big data decisions.
100%. Well, that's a great segue here into how we think about data at MetaRouter, right? So we generally believe that the data you activate is only as good as the data you collect. So garbage in, garbage out, 100%. But our goal is, in the data collection process, to really apply all these things to make sure that in that process, the data you collect is high quality, it's compliant, it's private, and that you're in total control over that data. Because instead of, Miles, to your point, managing a whole bunch of tags and who knows where it goes or what data it's collecting or where it's being routed, like all of those other piece parts, you only have to worry about one single tag doing all of that work, routing high compliant, highly secure, highly performant data into any of your downstream systems. So your CDPs, your analytics, your warehouses, wherever that data is going, that it is secure and really transformed so that everywhere that data goes is good. And so that's really what we're trying to do here. And I'm happy to say that, of course, we're so pumped about this topic, about this data. We're very, very passionate about it, which is one of the many reasons that we have become founding sponsors of the MarTech World Forum with Juan. And Juan, I'll pass it over to you real quick just to give a little plug, because we cannot wait to talk more about this topic. We call it the Data Trust Triangle at the World MarTech Forum in San Francisco in August.
I love the little cookie crumbs, Michelle, because we're super excited to be working with MetaRouter. MetaRouter is a founding partner, really helping to bring the MarTech World Forum, a global gathering of some of the most senior leaders in the marketing tech domain across 3 locations, Melbourne, San Francisco, and London this year. It's apply only, and it's only for the cream of the crop, the folks that are really leading marketing technology programs in some of the world's largest companies. So MarTech World Forum San Francisco is where you'll see MetaRouter. You can go to the MarTech Weekly / MarTech World Forum to check it out. And that's happening in August. We're very much looking forward to it. The data privacy triangle is something that we've been workshopping a little bit And it's a really great way to think about how to safeguard your brand against regulatory pressures, platform pressures, and also internal pressures around how to really future-proof data in your business. And so MetaRouter have been a fantastic partner, and we're just so excited to bring some original ideas and really great concepts to help leaders future-proof their business. So that's us. Very much looking forward to seeing you there. And if you want to reach out, you can find me on LinkedIn to have a conversation as well.
I love it. And then, of course, I would be remiss. I just signed up, Miles. I'm really excited because I really want to learn more about this topic and become more data literate myself. So I saw you have a weekly newsletter read by tens of thousands of industry professionals at the U of Digital. I love that you can just put it right on your phone. It makes it easy for when I'm drinking my coffee in the morning. I just want to scroll through some updates. So I don't know if you have any other things you want to share on the newsletter.
Oh, just that, yeah, it is read by just an increasing kind of army of digital ad and marketing professionals in the industry. I think the value that our audience gets out of this newsletter is we do apply our educational philosophy to it, meaning we are not trying to go over anybody's head with our newsletter. It's really meant to be kind of a quick hit roundup of what happened in the digital ad world, the digital media world in the prior week, along with like a little bit of opinion mixed in to give you kind of some quick ways to just interpret the news that you might be seeing in the industry week over week. But yeah, it's super popular with our audience. So yeah, invite everybody to sign up and hopefully you'll get a lot of value out of it.
And with that, we obviously got really deep, really passionate, which amazing conversation. So thank you both so much for joining. With that, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, please let us know in the comments. We will personally be reaching out and responding to every single one of them. So we want to keep this conversation going. Any thoughts, please pass them our way. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. So thank you guys so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Michelle. Really appreciate the time.
Likewise, thanks all.